me give one to Gene.
Well, Mr. McLaurin is looking to refer on slide 5.
If you could just speak up a little bit and identify yourself for the record, please, thank you.
Rashawn
We know who you are, but they, someone else might not.
Rashawn Banks, attorney with Dale Holness, candidate. Isn't it accurate that the overseas voter can return their ballot by mail, in person, or through someone else?
That-
The slide just says that.
Well, again, an absent voter, an overseas voter, has the ability to return it through various means.
Okay.
The issue becomes whether or not the 10 days does or doesn't apply. We applied the facts because that is referenced specifically in the statute and is referenced specifically on the voter certificate under UACAVA and under Florida law.
So we agree that it could be by mail, in person, or through someone else?
I'm not agreeing on anything, I'm just the lawyer. Is there, okay.
In 1S 2.030, subsection 4A, states an overseas voter has the option to return the voted ballot and signed certificate by mail, by fax, in person, or through someone else on behalf of the voter pursuant to the ballot instructions in subsection H.
I would agree that that is a quotation from 1S-2.030 sub 4.
Thank you.
And again, and just one last piece for the canvassing board. Again, the way that all UACAVA ballots are provided, there's a voter certificate, which is also promulgated under that same section of the Florida Administrative Code. And it specifies and as a warning to the voter, the UACAVA voters. In order to ensure your vote by mail ballot will be counted, complete, sign, date, and return the ballot and voter certificate as soon as possible to the Supervisor of Elections in the county in which you are registered. It must be received no later than 7 p.m. on election day in the time zone for the county in which you are registered. Then there's a second section that says overseas voters only. If you are casting a ballot in the presidential preference or general election, a 10-day extension applies, provided your vote by mail ballot is postmarked or dated, as was referenced before, no later than election day and received no later than 10 days after the election by the Supervisor of Elections in the county in which you are registered to vote.
Okay, so you're indicating that the 10 days applies assuming that they're overseas.
It is only applicable to overseas, that is expressly from the statute as well as from the administrative code.
I just have two questions. John McLaurin, on behalf of Dale Holness. Slide 7, Mr. Pittsburgh, where is that slide taken from? Where is that, the information in slide 7, where is that?
This is all of the competent evidence that can be provided to a canvassing board. Documents from their voter file, their voter registration, as well as.
I understand, but where is this taken from?
This is from various cases, from descriptions of how UACAVA is to be considered, what considerations a canvassing board can generally have. There's also, again, the second to last bullet point provides that there can be other evidence besides the various and sundry documents from their voter file and can be presented to a canvassing board, and if they elect to accept that, can be part of their consideration, as well as all of the things such as postmarks, the fact that they asked their ballot to be sent out of the country, that there's other documentation in their voter file.
Okay, so I guess the question is, for someone like myself, who's former military, who went overseas and was fighting in the war, and I had my ballot sent to my home, and had then forwarded to me, and I voted and I sent it back to home, why would my vote not count?
I did not make any such suggestion.
But how would you know whether or not I voted while I was overseas?
There's a million different ways that could be presented to a canvassing board, Jar.
I just wanna know from the reading that I see here, I mean, how would you know if I voted while I was overseas?
I don't know how one would know that you voted while you were overseas, but again,
So is the presumption that the vote is a valid vote, that it was overseas, and then you have to overcome the presumption, or is the presumption that it was an invalid vote, and then you have to somehow prove that it was a valid vote? What's the presumption in it?
if I can, Your Honor.
Yeah.
So, my legal interpretation of UACAVA and the Florida law is that if a voter has indicated somewhere in their record, and somewhere in the documentation, that they are or will be overseas, that the presumption is now in favor of that voter under Florida law. that their ballot came from overseas. If, however, there is nothing in a voter record to indicate that voter was ever overseas, there's nothing in their registration to indicate that they registered as an overseas voter, active duty military or otherwise. There's no request for a vote by mail ballot to be sent overseas. There's nothing in the file to indicate there was communication indicating that they were overseas. What you wind up having there is merely an individual who has indicated that they are either a member of the armed forces, who could be domestic or otherwise, or a family member of a member of the armed forces, who can be domestic or otherwise. UACAVA does not provide for other information other than checking those boxes, including providing, and again, also pursuant to section 1S 2.030 sub 2, if an individual is in fact an overseas voter, they are to indicate an out-of-county address as part of the process. So again, again, just being the lawyer and not a voting member of the canvassing board, that is my legal interpretation for the canvassing board's information for purposes of canvassing the remaining overseas votes, in consideration of overseas votes.
Okay. Any other questions or comments?
Can you, through the chair, can you ask each party to comment on my question on bullet point number 1 on slide 4? Because my reading of bullet point number 1 on slide 4 says, has nothing to do with a body of water, it has nothing to do with anything. It says, absent uniformed service member who by reason of active duty or service is absent on the day of the election involved. What does that mean?
Mayor, or Vice Mayor, it says absent from the
From the
United
United States, yeah.
And again, this is the definition of overseas voter within the statute. It just says that they are outside the United States.
I understand that, so if it says "or" there, my reading of the statute means it's any one of those bullet points, right? Because in the
Yes.
second one, so if you're, forget about a body of water, if you're sent to Canada, are you absent, are you out?
If you are in my
The other slide said if you're in Hawaii, you're over a body of water.
But it's
No,
not an
Hawaii and
overseas.
Guam
Do not count
Did
as
not
overseas. It's outside the jurisdiction of the United States. And Vice Mayor, my legal opinion, based on our review of UACAVA and Florida law, is if the voter is outside of the United States on the date of the election, by reason of active duty, by reason, or by other reason, if they are outside of the United States on the date of the election, they are provided with that benefit.
Of the extra day.
Of the extra
This is really what
days.
we're talking about.
Yes, and are deemed as quote overseas voter within the meaning of the statute.
Okay. Anything else? Anybody? Yes,
Yeah, I
Mike?
just, Jason Blank, on behalf of Sheila Cherfilus-McCormick, to that extent, and I just want to confirm this, Mr. Klitzberg, the definition of United States, under the further definition of overseas voter in Rule 1S, Administrative Rule 1S-2.030, which is subsection D, defines where used in the territorial sense means the several states, the District of Columbia, the Commonwealth of Puerto Rico, Guam, and the United States Virgin Islands and American Samoa. So it's not just limited to the 50 United States. You'd agree? Based on that definition in the rule?
Mr. Blank, I think that the rule speaks for itself. You did read it correctly.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Ms. Hall.
Judge Canvassing Board, like to present to you 4 ballots that, when you look at the information, these voters used an overseas address.
Okay, so we have received here 4 ballots. Staff has reviewed and indicated they use an overseas address. indicated that they're registered and give that address, right, in Belgium, according to your record.
Right, so I moved that this isn't eligible.
Hang on, we gotta make sure that this looks like the back of the envelope that was received does have an overseas postmark.
Yes. All right,
Okay.
and yeah, you can clearly see that the postmark was from Brussels, Belgium.
Motion to approve.
Second the motion.
All those in favor of approving this ballot as an overseas ballot, say aye.
Aye.
I'm sorry, just one point of clarification on that ballot. Is the postmark prior to the election or the date of the voter prior to the election? Jason Blanco, Sheila Cherfilus-McCormick.
Yes, the date from the Brussels, Belgium, Postal Service, says, October 21st, 2021.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Okay, so the next voter is. Should have that on the ballot itself, right? Okay, the next voter is registered and requested a ballot in Jamaica. And the records reflect that they requested an absentee ballot to an address in Jamaica, is that right?
That's correct.
Okay. And then it shows that there is a postmark from Jamaica. And that is the 20.
October 25th, 2021.
Sorry, the 29th.
Okay. That's two.
Well, either way, it's before the election.
Yeah, there's two postmarks on here, one's the 25th, one's the 29th, so we have two different.
They both are stamped in Jamaica, and so, you'll hear a motion on this.
Yes, I move that this is an overseas ballot and should be counted as such.
Second.
All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Okay, the canvassing board has elected to determine that is a ballot overseas ballot. Okay, the next voter is a registered voter with a local address who asked that their ballot be sent to an address in Canada. And it looks like the ballot was stamped in Canada. And it was signed by the voter on October 19th, 2021.
Motion to approve this ballot, overseas ballot.
Second motion.
All those in favor say aye. Aye.
Madam Chair, just, again, Jason Blank on behalf of Sheila Cherfilus-McCormick, a point of inquiry. We had previously submitted a public records request to the Supervisor of Elections Office for voter data on this specific ballot. And the last vote by mail request form that we had was from 2008. We were just wondering if we could have information on when the most recent vote by mail request was made for that voter. That was not previously provided.
Yes. My hope on this, I'm showing.
And if we need to get that answer in a few minutes, that's fine as well.
So I prefer to see my ballot by mail with a 2008 request there.
We have a request on September 14th, 2021.
Thank you so much.
Got it?
And I'm sorry, do we know if that request was made over the phone or by email or by mail? Do we know?
Email.
Thank you so much.
Okay, do I have a motion?
Let's see.
I'll move it, no,
Yeah, so this one, we have a postmark, right, but the postmark doesn't have a date, but there's a Canadian stamp, and then the date is October 19th, So I move that this is considered an overseas voter and should be counted as such.
Second.
All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Your Honor, I have some information regarding the next ballot.
Okay.
That is a voter who requested a ballot to be sent to an address in Dulles, Virginia, which is a government address. And when reviewing through the file and the records from the United States Postal Service, a copy of which is attached there, the postmark that is on that particular ballot contains is a diplomatic post office postmark with a reference to AE, which is Armed Forces Europe. So I just wanted to provide that information to the canvassing board as part of its review. If you look to the postmark on the actual envelope, you can see the information on there as well as the zip code associated with it, which again, according to USPS records, is an overseas Armed Forces Europe postmark.
So the ballot is signed by the voter on October 10th, 2021. It was requested to a Dulles, Virginia address.
Which is a government associated address, and then again, there's actually a stamp on there to indicate that it was diplomatic post. In fact, I believe says that the document is unclassified.
It says it's unclassified, and it says ballot of Gauda.
I think it's in this.
Motion to count that as an overseas ballot.
Where's the information that this stamp?
If you look on the opposite side of the envelope, you will see the postmark on there.
Okay, got it. Okay, all right, so from a diplomatic post office, and it was, on October 13th, 2021.
Motion approved.
Yep, this, seems to be an overseas ballot, so I second the motion.
Okay, all those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Okay. The council board has approved those four here. Those four overseas ballots. Not yet, I don't think.
Motion, we want to go through the rest.
One authority on those? Okay.
Okay.
Have a motion?
Motion to tabulate those four ballots.
Okay. All those in favor of authorizing the supervisor staff to tabulate those four overseas ballots, say aye.
Aye.
Okay.
No, not 5 o'clock yet, so we could get 100 more. I'd say I want to listen. It's just, we could. You can show up. Stranger things happen.
Judge, canvassing board, we have 6 ballots that are classified military.
So in order to review these ballots, then we need to determine whether or not the voter was active military and outside of the United States at the time the ballot was, sent.
Yes, Judge, the standard being that the voter, whether military or civilian, must have been outside of the United States on the date of the election.
Okay, so what we have, the first one, we have.
Your Honor, sorry, Robert Collins for candidate Holness. I'm sure you didn't mean it that way, but it's active duty or service, not just active duty.
Okay.
Just because the active duty may not include someone who is in service overseas but not on active duty. Just wanted to make sure we had that.
Okay, thanks.
You're welcome.
I'm an active duty uniformed service or merchant marine member. So there is marked as a military request. Address for this ballot is sent to was the Miramar address. Will Ms. Hall this particular ballot indicates that the person has a local address in here. There's also another address here.
Right. All 6 of these ballots doesn't have any overseas address on.
They all have local.
So they could have local or they could have stateside addresses.
Okay. All right, so this ballot has, an address in Miramar and an address in Maryland and a return ballot with no postmark. Okay. Just saying, see, in the Supervisor of Elections office on November 12th, it was signed by the voter on October 29th. There does not appear to be any indication of the person being outside of the United States.
So I'd like to make a quick comment. My own personal experience as a service member, I voted from Iraq in 2008. The ballot was sent to my wife in Fort Benning, Georgia. She sent it to me and I sent it back to her. And if I was, my ballot would come back looking like this. It would have come back looking like this, where there was nothing that indicated that I was overseas. I had no idea that I needed to notify the Supervisor of Elections office that I was overseas. So that's the experience that I had personally. With that being said, so I definitely feel that the weight that I did not want to take away the service members' right to vote, but we don't have any evidence here. If this was my vote in 2008, it probably would have been rejected because that's what the law calls for. And I think that's what the law calls for here as well.
I just wanna understand, how did this ballot get here? What, I mean, was it, it didn't come in the mail?
Yes, every ballot came in the mail.
So what's the indication that this ballot was not sent from, was the person when they voted, what's the indication that that person was not was not outside the United States?
There's no indication on this particular ballot or in any of the notes that indicate the person was either inside the United States or outside of the United States.
Right.
And
The presumption is that the
law
vote is-
requires that the person be outside of the United States. That's what the law requires.
I agree, Judge, but how do we know that the person was, or was, we just said we don't know if the person was or was not in the United States when the vote was cast?
So in order to get the benefit of the extra time, under the law, the person has to be outside of the United States.
I agree, Judge, there's no dispute.
So we have to have some evidence of that in order to consider the ballot. And what evidence is that we're permitted to look at is what we have.
Judge,
And
this
there
is-
are, I just wanna be clear, in this particular case, there are no notes in the voter file indicating that the person is anywhere outside of the United States. It does indicate that the person is active military, but it doesn't indicate that they're outside of the United States.
So Judge, this is why I asked the question about slide number 4, because nowhere in our slide number, I think was it 6 or 7? I forget which one it was now. But there's nowhere in the statute, there's nowhere in the rules of administration that defines who an absentee voter is the way that Mr. Klitzberg had put before the canvassing board. And this comes back to the situation again, where an active duty member requests a ballot, you don't know where you're gonna be deployed exactly. You're gonna be deployed in Germany, you might be in any specific city in Germany that you don't know before you get deployed. So you request your ballot comes to your house, your wife, your spouse, whoever it is, sends you your ballot, you fill it out, you send it back, and then that person sends it into the Supervisor of Elections. Why should your vote not count?
So correct me if I'm wrong, Mr. Klitzberg, but I recall you indicating that there was, information provided to the voter who requested the ballot, that unless they provided information that they were outside of the United States, that their ballot needed to be timely received.
Exactly. If you look at the voter certificate on a UACAVA ballot,
So it puts the voter on notice that unless they are, unless they are outside the United States and let the supervisor's office know that, then their ballot must be returned. It's not saying it wouldn't be a valid ballot if it had been received timely, that is by the date of election day. The question is whether or not it qualifies for the additional 10 days.
Right, but this one was Eugene Pettis on behalf of Mr. Holness. This was received today, I think you indicated.
Oh, no, these are all received
Okay.
within the time, the 10 days.
The 10 days.
The question is whether or not they get the benefit of that 10 days, and we have to consider that under the rules.
Your Honor, one of the things that I'm just trying to get some context, as I understood, the presentation, there's a presumption of validity. Unless there's some evidence to the contrary. It seems like we're flipping it around, that whoever these individuals are, the gentleman that I don't know if you said a gentleman, woman or man from Miramar, a service individual from Miramar, if they have represented that they are voting from overseas.
They don't represent that. They represent that they are active military.
Active military.
And it tells them, if you are active military, return your vote from wherever you are by election day, unless you are overseas, and then you need to let us know that, and you'll get the benefit of that additional 10 days.
And even further, I'm sorry, Gene, to step on you, but even further, Jason Blank Sheila Cherfilus-McCormick, again, referring to the administrative rule that guides and determines how this process is put forth, subsection 5A and B specifies the difference between a uniform active service, or active duty or service member stateside, and specifies that their ballot must be returned timely by the end of election day, and differs for those service members, active duty or service members who are absent, based on the definition we discussed earlier, meaning outside the territorial jurisdiction of the United States, and those are the voters that get the 10-day courtesy extension, if you will.
Right,
So,
and the canvassing board is at liberty to consider the notes and any other evidence that the person might be outside of the United States. So we could look to the voter notes, which we have in front of us.
and one thing I would also point out, Your Honor, is, I believe Your Honor noted that on the voter file, not only was the Miramar address, but there was a second address. However, it was domestic.
There were two addresses, both were domestic.
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
I think in the totality of the circumstances, Robert Vaughn again. One, the presumption is that the vote is valid. Then we start to look at indicia of whether or not this is someone who may have either had their ballot sent overseas or was overseas or absent at the time of the election and otherwise qualifies as set forth in everything we just looked at. What we have here is someone who indicated in writing as best they could, unless I misheard you, that I'm active duty, merchant marine.
No.
I misheard that one.
Yes.
So that
So
person indicated.
there's a box to check that says that I am an active duty uniform services, that I am an active duty uniform services or merchant marine member.
Right, so that's what I thought I heard.
So this person clearly checked, and we accept that they are an active duty military member.
Right,
Then the next question is, do they get the 10 days?
and what we have here, based upon what I'm seeing, is someone who assiduously made sure that they got it in before today, which seems to indicate that there is, in their mind, today being the deadline, which is they're overseas, at least from their perspective. This is not someone who is trying to take advantage or get it in by election date because they otherwise thought that that's the date that applied to them.
It indicates on the exterior of the ballot envelope that this was stamped by the Supervisor of Elections on November 12th, which is today at 11:41 a.m.
Exactly, which is, that person believes that today was their deadline.
But that's a pretty big jump, right? And with all due respect to Mr. Vaughn, I mean, that's a big presumption. We don't have any evidence to that except for a speculative belief. What we do have evidence of is a voter who very well may be active duty or services or in the Merchant Marines, but who is not entitled to the 10-day grace period. And I think that Supervisor Scott noted that although in his heart he may wish for this vote to count, and I agree with Mr. Vaughn, the presumption begins that the vote is valid, but it doesn't mean that a vote that is turned in late still should be counted. The voter may be eligible to vote had the voter voted timely. This voter did not, and therefore the ballot should not be accepted. It is late per the law.
And my friend is overlooking one thing, and that one thing being the presumption of validity. And until and unless we have clear evidence to.
Where are you getting that? Where are you getting that?
Where am I getting what now?
There's a presumption of validity if we need clear evidence to overcome that.
Everything that has been presented
Mr.
to
Clifford,
us,
I
all of
want
our,
to hear from you on that.
I'm sorry.
I just want to hear from,
Absolutely.
Mr. Clifford.
Judge, it is once the canvassing board has determined that the voter is an overseas voter, that the presumption that it is a timely accepted vote will apply. And again, without getting argumentative with members of the public on this particular issue, what they are in essence arguing is there is a presumption that every dependent spouse, every person who indicates that they're in the services, uniformed services, are on active duty, is by nature an overseas voter. And that is not what UACAVA provides. Florida law makes an express distinction between the rights that apply to members of the armed forces and members of the service and their dependent spouses and overseas voters. So
Okay, so
I would
that's
agree
what-
that a
that's what-
presumption applies, but after the canvassing board has determined that this is an overseas voter when dealing with
Okay,
challenges.
so that's where I was, Mr. Vaughn, it's just, and I'm just trying to get it clear, is that the canvassing board, first has to make the determination whether or not this person qualifies for the 10 days.
Right.
And the only way to get that 10 days is to be overseas or outside of the United States. So while we may find that the presumption is the person, we believe the person to be in the military and or in active duty or services, that doesn't mean that we as a canvassing board automatically jump to the conclusion that they're entitled to the 10 days. That's what we have to determine.
And I think I take no exception, I have no issue with any of that. Where I have the concern is our assumption, our presumption is towards not disenfranchising the voter. The case law is crystal clear, especially when this is an active duty person. This person took effort to make sure that they got it in by today's date. Why was today significant for them? And until and unless we have clear evidence that this person is not an overseas voter, what we're doing is disenfranchising somebody to then say, oops, we got it wrong. It should be the other way around. The vote should count, and if there is a challenge mounted that someone determines to be a valid challenge, this person would not have been improperly disenfranchised.
All right, do I hear a motion for the canvassing board with regarding this ballot?
Well, yeah, so ask one question before that, I'm sorry, Mr. Scott. I just wanted to know, just as a point of reference, I know that we talk about precedents all the time. This could not be the first time this has happened, Broward County Supervisor of Elections. So I just want to know what was done in previous instances when this very same circumstance happened.
The precedent and the law that was gone over by Mr. Klitzberg indicates exactly what I just said, which is, we, as a canvassing board, must determine whether or not the person is an overseas voter. That's the first thing we have to do, and then we can determine whether they're entitled to the 10 days. So in looking at this ballot, we have to first make that determination and then go from there. So do I hear a motion with regard to this ballot?
I mean, what I would say is, I have a very difficult time disenfranchising a member of the military. It's veteran, I mean, we just had Veterans Day yesterday and everyone smiled for the camera. I have a very difficult time. I mean, the military are the one that gives us the right to vote. I have a tough time as a matter of policy. I don't need you to applaud me, because it's very difficult. I have no problem if a federal judge says that I'm wrong, but I have a difficult time with 5 or 6 ballots that are timely here and disenfranchised. I won't disenfranchise a member of the military, so I'll move it.
Your Honor, to the question of precedent you would ask?
Yeah. No, I didn't ask that.
Somebody asked?
Yeah.
Oh, sounded like you, just kidding. I have here a record of 168 or 70, I may have miscounted 2 of them, times where we had votes in similar circumstances that were counted. I think with what Commissioner Udine is saying, with what the Supervisor of Elections is saying, where from in his own personal experience, as an overseas voter, his ballot was sent to a local address to be reliably transmitted to the Supervisor of Elections on time.
I
Yes,
don't
ma'am.
think anyone disagrees with
Okay.
anyone in this room. I think everyone feels the same way. The question is that we have got to apply the law here to these ballots. And
Agreed.
that's what I'm gonna ask the canvassing board at this time. Do I hear a motion? And if so, let me hear it.
So we had a motion from the Vice Mayor.
Is that a motion?
Could I ask one question before the vote?
Yes.
What Mr. Vaughn was just talking about, Your Honor, was the 168, 170 are individuals in November 2020 election that had local addresses that stated they were in military, requested it at their local address. They were in active military overseas, and we counted 168, 170 of them with the exact same.
Okay, does that mean that they voted, they got the 10 days, they didn't get the 10 days?
They did, they voted.
But does that mean it came within 10 days? I don't know what you're talking about. I mean, you're holding a piece of paper.
I assume it's you all.
What I'm saying is that the canvassing board has to make a decision, and I welcome comments. However, comments need to be, the information behind those comments, I need to understand. And what you're saying to me is that 100 and however many people said they were active military and they had local addresses.
Yes.
That has nothing to do with the correlation as to whether or not a person who is active military, who asks for a ballot to be sent to any address, local or otherwise, that gets the benefit of the 10 days. That's the question legally, the way I see it, okay? So that's why right now is that a motion?
Yeah, I served on the canvassing board in 2020. We didn't even really have this meeting in 2020 because no one even cared or no one paid attention to any of those ballots because it was too far away. We had the meeting, it was perfunctory, we didn't go through on a real vote by vote. At least I don't remember being here doing that. All I'm saying on this thing is there is 6 votes from active military with a presumption that they be valid. I want
You
them.
don't know that. You don't know that. You know this one is the one we're considering. It's a person who's filed an affidavit.
Well, there's 6 of them.
Well, I haven't looked, you see the review. These this one,
That's what we're talking about, this pile of 6 votes.
no, we're talking about this ballot.
This is the first one, I'm gonna be making the same motion for the first one, because they're valid.
Okay, so your motion is to consider this a valid ballot. Do I have a second?
All right, let me say this. This is, like he said, this conversation did not come up in 2020, this conversation was not had. I also wasn't the supervisor at the time, so this is literally the first time for me as a supervisor that we're going through this. If I were to say that this is a valid overseas ballot, that would mean that any military person or any dependent who is UOCAVA eligible mails in a late ballot, everybody, there are hundreds of late ballots back there.
Yes. Yeah.
We're gonna discard all of the, late ballots except for anybody who happens to be active duty military. Please keep in mind that the overwhelming majority of active duty military people are in the United States. They are not overseas. Active duty does not mean overseas. All right, that just means they're active duty. That would mean that when we come around to the 2022 cycle, all of the military votes that come after Election Day, we would count those, but not the other late ballots that come in. And to me, that is not, I mean, it's clearly not what the law says. The law says that they have to notify us that they're overseas. I did it wrong in 2008 because I did not notify the Supervisor of Elections that I was overseas. My ballot would have been turned down if I hadn't gotten it here in time. Something, perhaps the statute needs to change, but today the statute is clear. The person did not notify us that they were overseas, therefore it is not a valid. I move that this is not a valid overseas ballot.
And I second that motion. All those in favor of determining that this is not a valid ballot, say aye.
Aye.
So Judge, we will be launching a protest pertaining to that ballot, so we will need that information. On particular ballot.
We will separate.
Okay, well, let's do it one at a time.
Yeah.
Yes, okay. You wanna, this is the tabulation?
For the four overseas.
For the 4 overseas that were authorized for tally, you can announce those if you'd like to call.
For the 4 overseas ballot, 3 votes for Barbara Cherie, 1 vote for Phil Jackson. May we tabulate?
Motion to
I'm motion that we tabulate those ballots.
All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Okay, the next ballot that we have is a ballot that
I don't even know the name. I can't.
Phil Jackson.
Phil Jackson.
in the Supervisor of Elections office, looks like on the November 3rd, 2021, was signed by the voter on October 29th, 2021.